Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard. Welcome on exceptional place. Welcome in CEVRO Institute. You are not here for the first time. I don't have to say who we are, what we do, and why we do what we do. For you who are here for the first time, I have to introduce ourselves. We are small, I would say excellent, private college settled in the center of Prague, focused on politology, international relations, public administration, law, economy, and definitely security. And we believe in at least three values: freedom, rule of law, and free market economy. I don't have to say that it's pretty tough to propose an excellent education as a private school in Czech Republic, so any donation is welcome. I have the privilege to welcome a special guest this evening, and both of them became a part of my life, so my opening speech is going to be a little bit epic. First of them is a person I met a couple of years ago. I didn't know a lot about him. But then when I met him, when I had the possibility to know more about him and his institution, I definitely fell in love with not him, but with the way he works, the way he and his colleagues are thinking, and fell in love with their approach, how to analyze the problem and how to propose the solution of the problem. And I'm very glad that CEVRO Institute has a memorandum and very tight cooperation with an International Institute of Counter-Terrorism of IDC Herzliya. And I wish our administration and even the European administration can follow their approach how to solve the problem of terrorism on scientific, pragmatic, and efficient way. Welcome here, Boaz, and I hope that you will feel here in CEVRO Institute at home. So my welcome at home, Boaz Ganor. The second person I met a couple of years ago again. It was in time when he was serving to his country as a Secretary of Homeland Security Department. I can say that it was a good time. It was a time when Czech-American or American-Czech partnership wasn't an empty envelope. It was a time of trust, time of will, time of work. I could add a deep trust, strong will, and hard work. And we together work on a program which has changed the European policy. We work on the visa waiver program, which allowed us, and I can remind it to him and to Sasha Vondra, who was flying with me the November 17, 2008, as a first free flyer to United States. Oh, we were not alone, there were a lot of us. And it reminds me that not only the partnership can exist, but also if you have that strong will and if you have an ability to work hard, you can change even the whole European policy. And let's fix it in our minds, especially now when we are faced to such issues as terrorism and migration. And let's be a little bit proud of what we are able to propose to our colleagues, and let's learn a little bit from the history when, as I mentioned, the real partnership between United States of America and Czech Republic existed. As I announced, I was a little bit epic, but I hope that you understand why. I again welcome our guests here. Their speeches is not free of charge, so that I prepared a golden pin for them, and I have to say no more bills are allowed. So, guys, this is the only thing you can receive from us. But I believe that all of us are now willing to share your experiences and to listen what you are able to tell us about the issue. Again, ladies and gentlemen, welcome at CEVRO Institute. My dear friends and colleagues, welcome. And the floor after Sasha is yours. Thank you.
Well, freedom and security in the age of jihad, that's the title of our agenda today. And I am also very happy that Michael Chertoff has accepted our invitation and included Prague into his travel itinerary. So he was in Singapore, then we were together over the weekend in Bratislava for the famous GlobeSec conference, and he goes to Berlin from Prague tomorrow. Europe has a problem. That's no secret, and if there was some common sense, the last 2 days at the GlobeSec is the conviction that what we have seen in Brussels, in Paris, in the last couple of months, this is something what may easily repeat again, and we have to be ready for this. And to be ready, it means to listen to those who do have the experience, those who are able to learn the lessons. A couple of weeks ago, we have seen Federica Mogherini, the untitled foreign minister of the European Union, during the press conference, how she was crying. You know, the tears are great human expression, but this is something what any terrorist would really appreciate, because it means the success of the attack. So if we have to learn somewhere, and if Europeans should learn somewhere, it's either in Israel or in the United States. And the two gentlemen are the real leading experts on the counterterrorism in the current world. And maybe to those who has opened Hospodářské noviny daily today, it was in fact the opening article about the work which Michael Chertoff and the others are now trying to even offer to Europe. To introduce Michael Chertoff, he is a son of a rabbi, we discussed this, from the rabbi from Ashkenazi rabbi from New Jersey. The man who was educated at the Harvard Law School and first became famous in his country, in the United States, as the attorney for Southern New York, working closely together with Rudy Giuliani and bringing behind the bars two important guys. First, if the information is correct, Father Salerno from the Genovese branch of the Mafia, whose nickname was Fat Tony. So he brought Fat Tony behind the bar, but he also brought mayor of the New Jersey for money laundering behind the bar. Later on, when the United States were confronted with the terrorism of this famous to 9/11 magnitude, he was the one who has played a principal role in the George W. Bush team to tackle all the measures. So U.S. Patriot Act and other issues, that was the agenda of Michael Chertoff. And then in 2004, he was appointed the U.S. Secretary for Homeland Security, just the second in the history of this ministry, because before 9/11, the United States did not have the Homeland Security Department or the ministry. And in this capacity, he, just beyond these counterterrorism measures, he has also had to implement the other various policies which I think are of the same relevance like today, guarding the border of the United States, using the modern technology like the body screens and etc. Since 2009, Michael Chertoff is in the private sphere, so beyond his work for the law firm, he has established the Chertoff Group, which is one of the leading private firms for the crisis management, in particular in the area of security, including the counterterrorism. So we do have a really major league speaker, major league guest, and give him a broad Prague and warm Prague welcome, and floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and thank you for the very warm welcome my wife and I have received in Prague, and all of you turning out really means quite a bit. It is true that we worked very closely together when I was Secretary of Homeland Security, and it's a great lesson in the fact that hard work and trust are the ingredients of a successful security program, as well as so many other programs. And the relationships that we have between the United States and the Czech Republic and other countries in the region are really one of the strong positive elements of our world now, particularly at a time when we face so many different challenges. Now, I'm here to talk about freedom and security in what I think is rightly termed as the Age of Jihad. And just to put it in perspective, I'm well aware that there are a whole host of threats out there. We perhaps are in a time of more unsettled and dangerous challenges than we've seen in at least a couple of decades. There are issues, for example, with respect to the Ukraine. There are challenges in Asia with respect to an assertive China. But I'm going to put these to one side because I think the issue that is riveting people in Europe and the United States these days is the issue of jihadi terrorism. And we've seen, obviously, the effects of this just in the last 6 months with the attacks in Paris and in Brussels. And every reason to believe that this is not the last that we're going to see. So let me talk a little bit about what has worked in the past, what I think is different now, and what I think we must do to work together in order to increase the security and the protection for the people in Europe and in the United States, and in fact around the world. So let me first say, what do we mean by violent jihadism? I don't actually believe that the extremists who are behind Daesh or who are behind Al-Qaeda or similar groups that you'll find both in the region of the Middle East and elsewhere, I don't believe that they represent an authentic religious representation of Islam. But I do understand that they build an ideology which picks the language of Islam and tries to use that as a way to validate what is a violent and extreme approach to the world. I also understand that this is very much a product of what goes on in regions around the world. We are facing the rise of failed states. We've seen it in Libya, we see it in Syria, we see it in Iraq, we see it in other places. And these become fertile areas for recruiting people who are unhappy, who are disappointed, who are angry, and to turn them into terrorists, because they're being offered a narrative and an ideology that tells them that if they only pick up arms and fight the enemy, they will be eligible to go to heaven, and also they'll get a lot of material rewards as well. And this issue is not limited just to people in the Middle East or parts of Africa. We see people recruited in Europe and in the United States who are attracted by this ideology of violence, many of whom have very little knowledge of Islam, but convert really in order to become members of this violent group. If I look back historically, I like to think about us having dealt with three waves of violent jihadism. The first was Al-Qaeda, which of course launched the attack on September 11th, 2001. And the way they characteristically operated was they were actually managed in a relatively centralized fashion. What bin Laden and his chief lieutenants did was recruit and check and vet people who they wanted to bring on board as terrorist recruits, bring them to Afghanistan, train them, have them be further indoctrinated, have them pledge an oath to bin Laden, and then launch them to carry out attacks. Those were, in fact, the methods in which the hijackers who attacked on 9/11 were trained. But it was a very top-down approach, and what it meant was we could focus an awful lot of our efforts on what was going on overseas in the region of Afghanistan and similar areas. We began to see, though, a change over time and a more decentralized and networked version of jihadi terrorism. In 2008, you'll remember there was an attack in Mumbai, India. And this was not a big spectacle like 9/11, but it was a series of attacks that took place over 60 hours in various parts of Mumbai. The scale of the attacks were less than a big 9/11 or other major plots that Al-Qaeda used to try to hatch. But there were more attacks. It persisted for a long period of time. And we began to see that model of multiple small-scale attacks as being the next evolution of violent jihadi terrorism. We still have that, and that's what we saw in Paris and Brussels. But I would say that we're now also in a third wave, which is what I describe as crowdsourcing terrorism. That is the approach that Daesh takes, which is to say, if you can't come to Syria and Iraq to fight, if you can't train to become part of a network and carry out a multiple-pronged attack, do anything you can just to attack the enemy. Pick up a knife, pick up a gun, build a bomb in your, as they used to say, in your mother's kitchen using household chemicals, and just go out and randomly kill anybody. Now, those attacks obviously are less devastating than a 9/11 or even a Paris or a Belgium, but they create a sense of vulnerability and danger for everybody because of the concern that at any point in time an individual can come out and do what happened in San Bernardino, try to kill a number of people before they get caught. So bearing in mind these different iterations or these different waves of terrorism, how do we approach the issue of security particularly now in the age of the third wave? Well, we built a pretty elaborate and sophisticated security apparatus after September 11th. And that was when we were facing the more top-down, more centrally managed al-Qaeda. It had these various elements. First, as I said, most of the enemy's core was overseas. What that meant was, from the standpoint of protecting the United States and protecting Europe, what was important was to see what were the connections between that core overseas and activities in the homeland. That meant monitoring communications to see if there was back and forth discussion. It meant monitoring travel and seeing whether people were traveling from the region coming back to the U.S. or Europe. It meant monitoring finance, looking to see whether money was being used to finance terrorism that came from known terrorist bank accounts. Some of the tools we developed that allowed us to focus on travel, finance, and communication we still have. For example, passenger name record information, which the European Union has just voted to adopt as an approach or a policy here in Europe. That's an approach we took with respect to travel into the United States years ago. What we do is we take a limited amount of data generated by travelers for the airlines, name, passport number, how you paid for the ticket, where your address is, what kind of telephone number can be used to reach you. And by entering that in a database and correlating it with similar data that the intelligence community and the travel community generate, we are able to see that somebody is connected to a known terrorist. We went back when I was Secretary of Homeland Security, and we applied this technique to the hijackers of 9/11 to see whether, had we had this in place prior to September 11th, we would have been able to detect these terrorists before they got on airplanes. What we discovered was 15 of the 19 terrorists were in fact connected to each other with one or more of these data elements. And had we had this program in place then, we would have been able to connect them to terrorist financiers or terrorist operatives in other parts of the world. And they never would have gotten on the airplanes. So tools like this are very, very valuable tools. Also, I have to say, much of the approach we took to al-Qaeda after September 11, 2001 involved attacking them where they were headquartered, which is, again, in Afghanistan. They were driven out, and with their supporters of the Taliban, out of much of Afghanistan. And we used a variety of different techniques to kill or capture senior leaders in that region. Now, Daesh is somewhat different. As I've said, not only does Daesh crowdsource terrorism, but they have succeeded in recruiting more foreign fighters than al-Qaeda was able to do. They've also created for themselves literally a state within Iraq and Syria, which they have used to earn money using things like oil royalties or extortion. They've been able to train. They've been able to offer to their recruits certain kinds of material rewards, and they've been able to use it as a platform from which they can tell the world that they are winning the war against the West because they are still standing and we have not defeated them as we said we would. This means that they are in some ways a more formidable opponent than al-Qaeda was. They have the platform from which they can brag and boast and tell a compelling recruitment story to people who are looking for a strong actor. They have the territory and the capability to train and to experiment with more devastating weapons, and they have money generated from economic activity within this area. A second feature that makes it much more challenging in some ways to deal with Daesh is the fact that because of the foreign fighter phenomenon, they don't need to send foreigners into Europe or the United States. They can send citizens who have left back to their home countries. And obviously the ability to restrict a citizen's re-entry to his or her home country is much more difficult and more complicated than doing that with a foreigner who wants to come in to visit. Also, with the rise of this wave of migration we now see in Europe, while I believe that the vast majority of these migrants are not coming to do any harm, that does create a flow within which some terrorist operatives could choose to enter Europe. And because of the sheer number and the inability so far to track everybody who is in Europe who's come in through this migration flow, there's a real concern that some of these individuals will elude detection if we don't develop techniques that will enable us to figure out who they are and to begin to track them. Yet another element which I think has given Daesh, made them a more formidable challenge than al-Qaeda, is their much greater sophistication in the use of social media. You know, al-Qaeda used a little bit of social media. They used it to train and recruit over the internet. Occasionally they would have a kind of a town hall meeting, but they were very clumsy. Their degree of propaganda was very unsophisticated. Their reach was not very subtle, and they didn't have a great deal of scope. Daesh has been much, much more sophisticated in its development of social media, in its ability to use it to target those who are susceptible and then to lure them into communicating offline, in their ability to use video imagery as well as verbal language to promote their vision and their reputation as being tough and skillful. And so therefore that has added a dimension of challenge to people in the security community which is brand new. So how do we deal with this? Well, from a strategic standpoint, I would say there are 4 elements to what we need to do. First, we need to destroy their safe space. I understand that political leaders have talked about dismantling Daesh and defeating it for years now, and we haven't gotten it done. And let me tell you, that is a big mistake. We need to get it done. As long as they are out there and they're able to say that they're still standing and they are still creating their form of a, quote, caliphate, they have an ability to recruit and use that as a message that is very powerful. When they lose, when they're defeated, when they are crushed, that message will be crushed. Second, we need to do a better job of recruiting foreign fighters who are our citizens who go to fight and come back. That means we need to know when they're leaving, we need to know when and how they're coming back, and we need to have mechanisms in place to determine what they are doing when they are back, because although not all of them intend to carry out terrorist attacks, we have to assume that most of them do. Third, we need to look at the people who never leave to go overseas, but who nevertheless are part of the recruiting pool of Daesh, the people who they are, as I said, crowdsourcing, using the internet to encourage people on their own to take up whatever weapons they can find and carry out terrorist attacks. And we need to shrink that recruiting pool. So how do we accomplish these 4 strategic objectives? Well, overseas, as I've essentially said, I think it's going to take military action that's much more effective than we've seen up to now to ultimately turn the tide and destroy Daesh's base in Iraq and Syria. Much of the responsibility for this is going to lie with local actors, the countries of the region. But I think we are being naive if we don't believe that Western countries will have to play a role as well. And it will not simply be a matter of standing off at a distance and dropping bombs. It may involve putting people on the ground to help guide and make more effective the local forces that are working. Here, there are 4 things we have to do in our home countries to better protect ourselves. First of all, we have to do a better job of collecting information about who is a threat, given this much larger pool of people we have to worry about with Daesh than we did with al-Qaeda. Second, we have to do a better job of analyzing what they're doing so we can detect plots and frustrate them before they actually occur. Third, we need to share better. One of the sad lessons of what happened in Paris and Belgium was the fact that there were important pieces of information held by individual agencies, but they weren't pooled and they weren't shared. And it was in that silo effect, those gaps between intelligence collection agencies, that's where the terrorist plots in those 2 cities flourished. And finally, we have to do a better job of operationalizing and responding to terrorist plots before they can be successfully executed. And that includes, as part of it, dealing with social media. So with these 4 general prescriptions, I want to talk briefly about, and more specifically about, how we can carry out these plans, but do it without compromising our essential freedoms, because I believe we can without damaging the freedom that we cherish. First, let me turn, again, domestically to the issue of collection and analysis. As I've indicated, there's a lot of data that we already collect, and now that it looks like in Europe there's a plan to at least collect more data with respect to passenger name record information. But even now, much of this data is not integrated. There are fingerprint databases, for example, that apply to migrants who come in and are processed when they land in Greece. But there's a limited ability, and there are restrictions on whether you can use that biometric data, the fingerprints, to check other databases that might be held with respect to potential criminal activity or other kinds of issues. Likewise, the ability to check license plate numbers or locational data or other similar kinds of information and to bring it all together is restricted as a matter of law and policy in Europe and also has some technical barriers. But I can tell you this is exactly what you need to bring together and check. And let me tell you a story. Back when I was in office, we used to collect fingerprints from terrorist safe houses, and we would enter them into databases that we could use to check people coming into the United States to see whether their fingerprints had ever been found on a bomb fragment in Iraq, for example. And we were able to find people who satisfied that test and who actually we could demonstrate had been involved in bomb making because we had their fingerprints. That was the power of being able to integrate and combine and fuse the databases. I would argue that here in particular, where we have an influx of migrants coming in, it's critical to begin to combine together the data about the biometrics of those who land in Greece or other places, and the PNR data, and data about whether people are engaged in criminal behavior, and see where there are matches that suggest you are dealing with a terrorist or a potential terrorist. In this regard, it's particularly notable that a significant number of the people we saw involved in Paris and Brussels had petty criminal records. And what that tells us is that one of the fertile areas for recruiting are people who already have had encounters with the law, and maybe they've been in prison. That means, first of all, that criminal databases become as important to terrorism prevention as other kinds of databases. It also means we need to train the police to consider themselves as also a form of intelligence agents, people who are collecting information about the community and in which they operate, and who know enough so that when they see something suspicious, they notify the other intelligence authorities that there may be a potential terrorist act. More and more, the way you're going to detect potential terrorist operatives is not going to be by having satellites and spies over in Afghanistan or in Syria or Iraq, but by having local police and community leaders seeing something and reporting it so that there can be follow-up. On the issue of sharing and disseminating information, there's a Schengen principle now that allows people to travel freely within the European Union. There needs to be a Schengen for information. Intelligence information needs to move at least as fast as the speed with which human beings can move within the Schengen area. Otherwise, what's going to happen is the terrorists are going to move more quickly than the information that tells us how to catch them and stop them. Part of this is the use of modern technology. I can tell you in the 10 years since I was in office, technology has dramatically improved. There is now an ability to share information in real time in a way that makes sure it's not improperly used or improperly disclosed, but that means it can be effectively turned into an operational tool very quickly. We need to build those capabilities as part of the general improvement of information distribution and sharing, not only within Europe, but on a global basis. including other countries that are dealing with terrorist issues. Because remember, the friend of the terrorist is that gap between nations and between pools of information. Finally, we need to talk about operationalizing what we learn. And I think particularly as we deal with more and more of these crowdsourced attacks, there are three critical things we need to get better at doing. First, we need to be able to respond quickly and effectively. You can't stop every terrorist attack in a free country. But the difference between a bad event and a catastrophic event is how quickly you respond when there is an attack. In Mumbai, it took 60 hours, 60, for the Indian authorities to come in and be able to locate and stop the attack, and that was devastating. In places where we can respond within 3 hours or 5 hours or 6 hours, as bad as a terrorist attack is, that restores public confidence. Second, we need to be more strategic about how we deal with social media. First, how we mine it for information to see who is out there that is talking about committing a terrorist act or is doing things that suggest pre-operational planning. But we also need to be able to use social media to push back against those who recruit and to undercut the narrative and make sure that they are not the only ones using a platform in order to promote their form of violent ideology. And the third part of this, which flows from the social media, is that we need to be able to counter violent extremism, which means we need to understand better and be more effective in using that understanding about why people radicalize, why they become willing to become suicide bombers, and how we counter that and deprogram them. And in this respect, I have to say, one of the challenges we have is it's often the case that the only recourse when someone is reported as being a terrorist is to have the authorities come in and arrest them and prosecute them. And the problem is that if you're a parent or a friend and you think that a loved one is becoming radicalized, you're faced with a horrible decision. Do you turn them in and have them arrested and go to jail, or do you hope for the best and turn a blind eye? We need to come up with a third way, a way in which we can tell parents and tell friends that if you report somebody who's becoming radicalized, we won't prosecute them. What we'll do is we'll try to deprogram them, and we'll put them into a legal process that works on changing the way they think about this and getting them to renounce the extremism, but not one that necessarily is going to be a criminal justice approach or a prosecutorial approach which taints a person forever. So that ability to come up with a third way, I think, is going to be an important part of the agenda as we move forward. Finally, let me say, I don't think any of what I've suggested impairs fundamental freedom. I understand many people get nervous about data being collected and integrated. They worry it's going to be misused. But I think experience shows that serious oversight, as well as actually embedding in the technology certain kinds of restrictions about how the technology is used and how people use the information, can offer a significant level of assurance that people will not misuse the information that's collected. And I think in part this reflects the importance of continuing to maintain the view that we only collect information for purposes that is proportionate to what we're collecting, and that we are careful in governing limits about how we retain information. I also think as we look at social media, we need to also make sure we're respecting rights of free speech, and we don't move from dealing with social media that is operational planning or terrorist recruiting and begin to spill over into regulating or preventing social media that's merely an expression of a politically unpopular view. But again, I think we've seen that it is possible to distinguish between terrorist recruiting and operational activity on the one hand and free speech on the other. And finally, I do think we need to make sure we don't compromise those elements of our internet architecture that are part of maintaining the fundamental elements of our privacy and security. There's a lot of debate now about encryption and whether the government should require the private sector and companies that provide internet services to build into their security backdoors or vulnerabilities so that law enforcement can access and decrypt communications. I understand why law enforcement wants to do that. But unfortunately, when you weaken encryption, you weaken it for everybody, including criminals and terrorists. And it would be a shame if we weakened the security for the vast majority of innocent people in an effort to be able to enhance security measures by the police and by the intelligence agencies. I believe that we can give our police and intelligence agencies the tools they need to frustrate terrorism while preserving tools like encryption that allow innocent people to preserve their privacy and security. The challenge of reconciling security and freedom has always been part of what a free society has to deal with. It'll continue to be part of the challenge here, but we don't have the luxury of ignoring one and pursuing the other. And I think it's going to be up to people like those in this room to continue to evolve what we do in a way that respects all of our values and the rule of law. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very, very much. Exactly 30 minutes. So. Where's the major league response? And we are very glad that Boaz Ganor accepted our invitation. In fact, we were looking for somebody from IDC Herzliya to come to give the comment to Michael Chertoff, and if Boaz got to know that Michael Chertoff is coming to Prague, so he reacted, I will come too. And also thank you very much for helping us with covering the costs of the visit, because originally we were thinking about the cooperating with the US Embassy on that particular day, but then they were somehow late and they preferred some other agenda. So thank you very much also with that. Unfortunately, just during our talks here, there is another incident or terrorist attack in Jerusalem, what I just heard from Tomáš. So the bus in Jerusalem got under the attack, and there are some injuries. It's too fresh to tell you more now. So it just illustrates how important is to defend us against that permanent threat. And Boaz, it's not the first time here among us, so you who are coming regularly knows that he's one of the leading experts on counterterrorism in Israel, in the world. He's lecturing both at the university on this, and is running this special center, the ICT Center in Herzliya. He regularly published to the various magazines and the world newspapers like Wall Street Journal and others. So I can't imagine a more competent man to come to Prague. So Boaz, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sasha. I'm really privileged to be here, to be invited to CEVRO once again. I'm privileged to be affiliated with CEVRO, and I would like to thank the leaders of CEVRO, Ivan, Sasha, and Tomáš, for having me here. But I'm also, as Sasha, you mentioned, very privileged to be here today because I feel humbly to be the sidekick of Michael Chertoff, who is one of the persons which I highly appreciate, combining an extensive knowledge on terrorism on one hand and practical, proven experience in the field. So, as you rightly noted, when I was asked to choose somebody from ICT to come to that event, I said, I'm the one who's going to come and to join you here. The subject matter that is being discussed, freedom and security in the age of jihad, in my view refers to what I call the art of counterterrorism. Michael, you maybe don't know that, but in my view, you are an artist, a mega artist. Because to be a counterterrorism expert is to be engaged in the art of counterterrorism. And I would like to describe very briefly in the few minutes that I have with you those few points, actually 5 points, of the art of counterterrorism. While doing that, I'll make some PR to my books, The Counterterrorism Puzzle and Global Alert, but forget about that. It's just to illustrate the art of counterterrorism. So the first element of the art is trying to understand, trying to comprehend who is the enemy, who are those terrorists, what's the difference between one terrorist and another terrorist, and then we can maybe learn how to contend with this phenomenon, to contend with the terrorists altogether. I would like to suggest the classification between 3 types of terrorist activists, between 3 types of perpetrators of terrorism. The first type is what we all refer to as the lone wolf attack, or I prefer to use the term the personal initiative attack. Personal initiative attack, and I brought here 2 examples of a personal initiative attack, both of them from Europe. One was the Mahdi Namush terrorist that attacked the Jewish museum in Brussels, and the other one was Mohammed Mra that attacked the Jewish school in Toulouse, in France. This is the personal initiative attack. The personal initiative attack starts and ends with the sick mind of one person. The lone wolf attack, the personal initiative attack, is not operationally connected to a terrorist organization. The terrorist might be inspired by this organization or the other organization, but is not operationally connected to an organization. That's the personal initiative attack. The second type of attack is the local initiative attack. The local initiative attack is quite similar to the personal initiative attack, but it is not being conducted by one person. Usually it's a group of 2 or 3 or 4 activists that are family members, might be friends that have been radicalized together, and one day they decide to commit the attack. Again, they might be inspired by a terrorist organization, but not operationally connected to a terrorist organization. Examples like that we could see with the attack in San Bernardino in California, a husband and the wife, or the brothers that conducted the attack in Charlie Hebdo newspaper in Paris. The third type of the attack, of the classifications of the attack, is the organized attack. The organized attack, it's an attack in which a terrorist organization is not just responsible for the attack, but the terrorist organization is actually the one who planned, initiated, prepared, and executed the attack at the end of the day. Now, I have good news and bad news in reference to the comparison between the personal initiative attack, the lone wolf attack, and the organized attack. As for the personal initiative attack, it was mentioned by Michael, most of those attacks are less lethal, you have less casualties, compared to organized attacks. That's the good news. The bad news is that until recently, we counterterrorism experts around the world tend to believe that it's very difficult, very hard, and maybe even impossible to prevent those attacks from taking place. The reason was because it's very difficult to know and to have an intelligence warning before the attack occurs, because once again, it starts and ends with the sick mind of one person. You don't have others that he cooperates with, that he shares his plans and activities, and therefore it's very difficult for intelligence service to infiltrate to the process of planning, preparation, and execution of the attack. Organized attacks, on the other hand, are much more lethal. For example, the 9/11 attack, the November Paris attack, the 7/7 bombing, and so on and so forth. Those are organized attacks, and they have much more casualties, but you have a better chance to have an intelligence warning that might prevent the attack at the end of the day. So this is the good news and the bad news in this regard. Now, let's move on. The second challenge of the art of counterterrorism is not just knowing who are the perpetrators, is try to understand the rationale of the perpetrators. Now, it might come as a surprise to you, my friends here in this beautiful Prague, but I would say that terrorists in general, and of course I'm generalizing here, terrorists in general are rational actors. And I refer to organization, I refer to the leaders of the organization. In most cases, I refer even to the perpetrators themselves. You know, there are two misconceptions in reference to the rationality of terrorists. The first misconception is those that refers to the terrorists as irrational actors, lunatics. How could a person who is ready to strap himself with a suicide belt could be regarded as a rational actor? Well, all the research that has been done on failed suicide attackers shows one thing: they are not lunatics. The second misconception is exactly the opposite misconception, in which one refers to the terrorists as rational actors, but then attribute to them his own rationality by saying they would do this or they refrain from doing that because this is exactly what I would do in these conditions. What is a rational decision-making process altogether? You see it in this diagram. The rational decision-making process is a process in which one is calculating costs and benefits of different alternatives and choosing the alternative which he believes is more beneficial than costly. That's a rational decision-making process or a rational behavior. By the way, we all are doing that on a daily basis. When we decide what we do on that day, what we wear, we calculate costs and benefits and choosing the alternative which we believe is more beneficial than costly. That's exactly what the terrorists are doing. But I would like to argue that their rationality is subjective. It's based on their own subjective calculus of costs and benefits. And again, I would like to refer to something that has been mentioned by Michael. There is no generic rationale of terrorists, because the rationale of Al-Qaeda is different than the rationale of Daesh or ISIS. The rationale of ISIS is different than the rationale of Hezbollah or Hamas. Furthermore, this is a very dynamic process in which the rationale of ISIS today is different than the rationale of ISIS, say, a year ago, and probably will be different from the rationale of ISIS a year from now. So this effort of counterterrorism experts, the artists of counterterrorism worldwide, is to try to understand the rationale of the terrorist on an ongoing basis. It's not something that we can crack. We now understand the rationale, and that's it. We can lay back and we know everything. No, it's an ongoing effort. That's why it's a very challenging art that we need to deal with. Look at those pictures. Those are terrorists that have been conducted, Palestinian terrorists, that have been conducted lone wolf attacks in the last 3 months. You see common denominator in their face. It's amazing. They are all smiling, just have been captured. And they are all smiling with what? With something that I would suggest to understand as satisfaction. Actually, they just fulfilled the goal that they wanted to achieve. This is exactly based on their rationale, on their the way they calculate costs and benefits. And they believe that what they did is much more beneficial than costly for them. Now, this actually leads us to try to understand a little better this phenomenon of lone wolf attack. When we talk about the lone wolf attack, you see different strategies that are being used by the lone wolves, worldwide, by the way. As said before, less little modus operandi. We see stabbing, we see sabotaging, we see rundown by using cars or bulldozers, sometimes even shooters. What you don't see is the most complicated, sophisticated attack. I would argue that all suicide attacks that has to do with bombing attacks, all of them are organized attack and not personal initiative attack. This is why, by the way, when I was introduced to the attack in Brussels, immediately, few minutes after the attack occurred, and I was asked to analyze that by a few journalists, I said immediately, this is not inspiration attack. This is not a personal initiative attack, because those were suicide attackers. This is an organized attack which was planned and operationally controlled by a terrorist organization, in this case, ISIS. Look at this picture. This is in Israel, a stabbing that occurred, and you see the behavior of the person who's stabbing these civilians in a bus station. Now, I refer to those people as the jihadist zombies. Why do I use the term zombies? Because many of them refer to themselves with a sense of honor. They are doing the honorable thing. And I think it's important for us, the international community, to say exactly the opposite. There is no honor. There is only shame in this zombie behavior. Regardless, by the way, what is your goal? Your goal could be a holy goal. It could be a legitimate goal. It could be justified goal. But these types of attacks that are aimed against civilians, this is a zombie and unhonorable behavior. Now, you think it's an Israeli problem? Well, we see the attack of a British soldier by another jihadist zombie in London itself, Lee Rigby, that actually was stabbed and executed in the street of London. And the attackers didn't fled away. They actually stayed there to brag about the activity, the honorable so-called activity that they have done in London. United States, you could see another zombie, Mr. Thompson, that actually converted to Islam and decided to kill NYPD officers in the street by using axe. But this case, the Thompson case, actually gives us, I wouldn't say a shred of hope, but gives us a new approach to this phenomenon. We saw it in the last wave of lone wolf attacks in Israel time and again. As I said before, we counterterrorism experts used to say that it's impossible to thwart those terrorist attacks because we will not have an intelligence warning. Well, I would revise this argument right now. In many cases, including the case of Mr. Thompson here, but in many cases in Israel, the address was on the wall. And I refer to the Facebook wall. Actually, the address was there because many of those terrorists have been given an early warning in the social networks that they are planning to become shaheeds, planning to become suicide attackers. They are planning to conduct a terrorist attack. So I would argue that the web, the internet, serves on one hand the terrorists that actually radicalize those personal radical terrorists that decides one day to conduct the attack, being inspired by the terrorist organization, but on the other hand, they are also, the network can serve as a replacement for traditional intelligence. Human resources, communication resources can now in many cases be replaced with OSINT, open sources intelligence. And again, Michael was referring to the need to deal with big data. And the big data could serve today very well to have this signature on the radar on the intentions of individuals to conduct those attacks. The question, what do you do with this information that you gather? This is a different question to be dealt with later on. Now, let's talk, I talked about the personal initiative attack. Let's talk a little bit about the organized attack, an attack which is being organized by a terrorist organization. Well, you see that I use the ads of Coca-Cola. Unfortunately, Coca-Cola doesn't pay me to do that, but nevertheless, I used it in order to stress an idea. The idea is that, in my view, terrorism is a fashioned thing. Terrorism is a certain type of fashion. Let me share with you an anecdote. A friend of mine, many years ago, used to own the most popular nightclub in Tel Aviv. And he invested millions of shekels in this specific nightclub. And then one day, I read in the newspaper that few blocks away from his nightclub, there is a new nightclub which is going to be opened. And now they are investing millions of shekels in building a new nightclub there. I was so surprised to learn that the one from the newspaper, that the one who's building the new nightclub is again my friend that owned the previous nightclub. So I called him and I said, what are you doing? You're competing with yourself? He said, look, I'm in a fashioned business. In few months' time, in a year or so, people want to have another fashion. And why should anybody else bring the new fashion? I will bring the new fashion, and I will steal my own customer from the previous nightclub. That's exactly how we should understand terrorism. Terrorism evolves in a fashioned manner. You could see here, for example, the IRA giving birth to the provisional IRA, giving birth to an organization which refers to themselves as no less than the real IRL. Why do I use Coca-Cola ad? Because Coca-Cola refers to themselves, we are the real thing. And I wouldn't name compared to who. You know all compared to who. So the real IRA is so-called the real thing compared to the IRA. And the PFLP-GC, the Jibril organization, the Palestinian Liberation Front, General Command is the real thing to the Palestinian Liberation Front of Habash. Hamas is the real thing of Fatah organization. And right now what we see is that ISIS is becoming the real thing of Al-Qaeda. As we speak, we see individuals, networks, and organizations that used to be loyal to Al-Qaeda change their loyalty from Al-Qaeda to ISIS all over the world. Now, we are talking about the campaign in Iraq and Syria, which is crucial. And again, I agree with Michael that there is a need to have a different approach, much more effective approach to deal with ISIS in Iraq and Syria. But my friends, it's like a balloon. If you press in one side of the balloon, then the air goes to the other side of the balloon. And right now, ISIS is not just a problem of Syria and Iraq. We see ISIS very active, ISIS activists very active in the Maghreb countries, in the north of Africa, in Libya, in Mali, in Southeast Asia, and other places altogether. The third element, the third pillar of the art of counterterrorism is what I refer to as the equation of terrorism. I can speak about that for hours, but I would say it in 2 minutes. What is the equation of terrorism? The equation of terrorism is a very simple mathematical formula that has two factors: motivation and operational capability. It means that when a certain people, a certain group of people has both motivation to use terrorism to attack, and they have the operational capability that allows them to materialize the motivation, then a terrorist attack or a terrorist campaign would occur. From the formula of terrorism, we can therefore learn what is the formula of counterterrorism. The same formula. If you want to fight effectively terrorism, you need to deal with the motivation that gives birth to terrorism. You need to neutralize that. And you need to lower down and dilute the operational capability. If you deal only with one factor, it's not a solution for terrorism. And unfortunately, most of the leaders which I met around the world understand one factor, but turn a blind eye to the need to deal with the other factor. Either they want to deal with counter-motivation trends or counter-operational capability. The challenge is to find a balance between the two. That's the art of counterterrorism. Why it's a challenge, by the way? Because there is a contradiction between the two. If you want to lower down the operational capability of the terrorist, how do you do that? You use operative measures. You kill them, you arrest them, you dry their monetary sources, and so on and so forth. As effective as you do all of the above, you raise their motivation to retaliate. That's the boomerang effect in counterterrorism. How to balance between the two? That's the art of counterterrorism. I would say then you need to read my book for that, but I would skip that. Now, the fourth point which I want to mention is another balance that needs to be created, and it has to do exactly with the discussion of today, freedom and society. I call it the democratic dilemma in counterterrorism. Like it or not, again, it was mentioned by Michael. If we like it or not, there is a tension between our liberal democratic values and our need for security. Some people around the world tend to turn a blind eye to that factor. If I can quote from my memory the inauguration speech of President Obama in 2008, he said something along the lines, we regard it as false that there is a contradiction between our values and our security. I was asked by Israeli journalists, what do you say about this statement? I said, if he's right, I should get a PhD because my PhD is about the Israeli democratic dilemma in counterterrorism. I actually wrote 300 pages explaining this tension between our security and our liberal democratic values. So that's a problem. But there is another problem that has to do with the democratic dilemma in counterterrorism. And it has to do with governing. The government, after a terrorist attack occurs in a liberal democratic society, the government is under severe pressure of its own constituency, of its own population, to do something about it, to see to it that it will never happen again. And for that matter, in order to protect the public, they are ready to give the government, or expect the government to give all the needed prerogatives to the security services around the country, regardless about liberal democratic values. Now, if the government would stick to the liberal democratic values and say, no, we are not going to give those prerogatives to the security services, they will be out of their position in no time. They will not be able to govern anymore. In the next election, somebody that will come with a so-called miracle solution that suggests just give me the power and I would end terrorism, he will win the elections. If you ask me, we see the beginning of this process in Europe itself. Maybe even the Trump phenomenon in the United States refers to that concept as well. So what we see here is the governance dilemma that has to do with the democratic dilemma. Because if the leaders will turn a blind eye to their commitments, liberal democratic commitments, they will play into the hands of the terrorists that want to show that they are fighting against illegal, immoral, and unhuman creature, the government. What's the solution? The art of counterterrorism. Finding the balances between those two ends, our liberal democratic values and our security, understanding that we are going to sacrifice some of our security in order to preserve our liberal democratic values, and we are going to sacrifice some of our liberal democratic values in order to preserve our security. Last but not least, has to do with public resilience. Again, it was mentioned by Michael, the importance of the public in counterterrorism. He was referring to something that his office was actually invented. See something, say something. The importance of the public is force multiplier of police, of security services, and so on and so forth. But there is another thing that has to do with the public, and this is the resilience of the public. We just had this terrorist attack a few minutes ago in Jerusalem. I want to tell you about another terrorist attack, and I would finalize with that. A few years ago, we had a suicide attack in Tel Aviv, in a bus in Tel Aviv. A few minutes after the attack, I was getting a phone call from a journalist, and he was asking the regular question. As a counterterrorism expert, what do you think? Who did this attack? Why now? Why did they attack in Tel Aviv? Why a bus? All the regular questions. But then he surprised me with a question that I didn't anticipate that he would ask. And he said, okay, and what are you going to do about that right now? So I said, what do you mean, what are we going to do about that right now? Do you mean me personally or the Israeli government? He said, no, you personally. What are you going to do about that right now? I said to him, I was much younger back then, I said to him, this is Thursday afternoon. Every Thursday afternoon, I play basketball with my friends. Now, right now, there was a suicide attack in Tel Aviv. I don't know who died there. Maybe somebody I know, maybe a family member of mine. But I'm going to play basketball with my friends right now because this is my personal answer to terrorism. The terrorists are not going to change my behavior, my life, my day-to-day activity. That's the way, this is the resilient way that the public at large should counter terrorism. So he actually wrote a piece and he took this picture, this should have been me, fighting terrorism on the basketball court. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. So we got 2 keynote speaks. Well, I think the time comes for your contribution too. So we do have about, let's say, 25, 30 minutes for your questions, comments. So raise your hands and I will try to give you microphones through some of our cooperating movements here, there, and please introduce yourself before raising the question. And if you can, you may use the Czech language too, so we do have interpreting here.
Good afternoon. So you prefer the Czech language to English?
What do you prefer? But loudly, please.
English is all right. Okay, good afternoon. I am Dominik Franěk from Anglo-American University. And I would like to ask Mr. Chertoff, I would like to ask if you could explain to us the unwillingness of the American administrative to declassify the full report on the 9/11 attacks. Thank you.
Can you repeat this again, please?
I'm sorry to hear. Speak a little more loudly.
It's open, it's switch on, yeah.
I think it is. Okay. I would like to ask if you could explain the unwillingness of the U.S. administration to declassify the full report on the 9/11 attacks.
I think this refers to, I guess, some news stories about some portion of the 9/11 Commission report that was classified that was not released. Not having seen it, and if I had seen it, I wouldn't be talking about it anyway. I can't really answer. I mean, generally speaking, classified information is not released because it either reveals sources and methods that would compromise future security, or the basis on which the information was received from the sending authority had certain conditions on receiving the information. Obviously, it's shared with decision makers, but it may not be something that was going to be released publicly. But it'd be guesswork for me to speculate about it.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Karina Frankova. I would like to ask Michael Chertoff about something what Boaz Ganor said. You were saying that when we crash them, the message will be crashed. But then we have here, this cost-benefit analysis and think about motivation of these people who are doing terrorist attacks. Do you think there's something else we can do? Not military attack, but something with the motivation of people who are attacking us. And if so, who is the one who should be doing that? Who should be the leader? If it's America or some more institutions. And then because we are on the CEVRO Institute, and as Mr. Langer said, here we talk a lot about freedom and free market. isn't the freedom and free market better solution than military action? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think that's a good question. We don't fully understand why people become terrorists. And maybe the answer is there is no one answer. There are a whole host of different motives. So obviously the way in which you can counteract that is, from a strategic standpoint, very important. And I will say to you, the government can enable countering it, but the government can't do it because the government doesn't have the credibility to say to people, you know, you're misinterpreting Islam or your ideology is wrong. It's got to come from people who are trusted. But what the government can do is give them a platform and a set of tools that they can use to make the case that the ideology is false. I will say this. I mean, if you look at the recruitment pattern of a significant number of terrorists we're now seeing, particularly in the West, it's not terribly different from what we see with gang recruitment. If you go into some inner cities in the U.S., or you go into Central or South America in some countries, gangs recruit people using very similar techniques to what Daesh does, including, by the way, beheadings, hangings, torturing people, and making a visible public show, which actually attracts a certain kind of person. So we've got to be able to counter that. And again, it's likely to be coming from the community with the government enabling it, but not the government doing it itself. I don't know, Boaz.
Thank you. My name is Václav Majkut, and I have a question for Mr. Ganor. In 2014, the Sofan Group released a report in which they stated that the number of foreign fighters in Syria was about 12,000. 18 months later, in 2015, in December, they updated the report, stating that the number actually increased to 30,000, which is a lot. I mean that the previous record holder, the 1980s Afghanistan war, also attracted a large numbers of foreign fighters overall, but there seems never to have been more than 3,000 to 4,000 foreign fighters at any one time in Afghanistan. So my question is, why is Syria attracting so many foreign fighters? Because not all of these fighters can be considered jihadists, but many can, as they spend a lot of time in the trenches with Al-Qaeda linked groups. So what might be the main drivers of such an influx? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. First of all, the numbers are not necessarily accurate because nobody knows exactly what are the numbers. But I think that when we compared 2014 to 2015, there was a build-up, a bigger number than it used to be in 2014. And therefore, the question is well put. What are the reasons that youngsters decide to join ISIS and actually to travel from the comfortable homes in Muslim countries or in the Western countries and join the fight there? I think it's a combination of few things altogether. It has to do with adultery processes, with dilemmas that young adults has, and the natural need for excitement. I think it has to do a lot with social networks that let people communicate and be brainwashed, actually. If in the past a young adult wanted to be radicalized or want to go to the path of radicalization, you need to travel to a certain, say, mosque or a cultural center and to be accompanied with a certain very radical known spiritual leader. Right now, he can go to his personal computer and open it and be radicalized in that regard. But it's much more than that. One thing that might be an immediate answer to your question is the fact not only that ISIS is so well acquainted with new media, with YouTube videos, with social networks, but also that they could prove on those years, 2014 and 2015, that they are victorious. People wanted to join the victory of ISIS. And by the fact that they won battle after battle, they became more attractive to those youngsters. What we see today is exactly the opposite trend, by the way, because we see that the victories of ISIS have been stopped in the last few months. Actually, they lost quite considerable sum of their territory. And I believe that we would see now less people which are interested in joining the fight in Syria and Iraq. You want to add something?
Well, I don't see what there is. Tomáš?
Tomáš Pojer. So what would be your advice, both of you, in 3 points, what the European governments should do now, looking from outside into the EU Schengen zone, whatever you choose? What would be the 3 key points to do to change?
Maybe if I may add a question, because it was broadly discussed in Europe as part of the aftermath of the Brussels, in particular the Brussels terrorist attack, because it exposed the real deficiencies. Belgium looked almost like a failed state. So there was the debate whether, the European countries should build some kind of a EU FBI or Shin Bet or Mossad or CIA. What is your opinion about it as a part of the issue? What the European states should do? And second, what is your view about this?
So I don't think that Europe ought to jump into creating a new European EU-run institution like an FBI or a CIA. I mean, that may come someday, but I think this has to be more of a bottom-up effort. And I would say there are, broadly speaking, 3 things. One is I do think Europe needs to make sure that the capabilities of the nation states who have the primary responsibility for national security are raised to the level they need to be. Some are better than others. And unfortunately, in a Schengen world, the weak link hurts everybody else. And some of that means standardizing and making interoperable the kind of information that's collected so it can be more easily shared. The second point is you need to have mechanisms for sharing. Because as I said in my early remarks, you've got a lot of databases. If you don't combine them or have the ability to look across all of them, you don't get a complete picture of the people that you're looking at. And we dealt with that issue in the U.S., and it's not easy to fix. I mean, I don't want to overstate the difficulty, but it's not easy to fix. But you needed to have the ability to search across the multiple databases. And the third element is you've got to be able to turn the intelligence into something that's usable operationally. Some of that involves making sure that your police and your other law enforcement are trained and equipped and capable of responding in real time quickly to an event, because it's the event that continues indefinitely that creates the biggest problem. And part of it is the countering violent extremism strategy. I think there needs to be real focus effort, and I think Boaz has done a good job of talking about the different models of what leads people to become terrorists and how they operate. I think that the countries need to get into the places where the recruiting is happening and better understand what's going on and better work with the community to counteract it.
Briefly, I would say that one of the biggest challenges that Europe is facing today, as we all know, is the wave of immigration coming from Syria, coming from Iraq and other countries altogether. The first thing I would recommend Europeans to do is be more selective in the immigration process. The second I would recommend, I mean, reference to the first one, is develop better integration processes, because I'm much more concerned with the second generation immigrants compared to the first generation, and integration might be an answer to that secondary process altogether. So that's the first recommendation. The second recommendation is you should cancel Schengen. I know I'm taking that very far, but when Michael Chertoff was mentioning the weakest link, when Schengen is taken place, then all Europe is fragile based on the weakest link of security in Europe. So if the Belgic people, or the Belgic security services are not knowledgeable enough, not acquainted, incapable of securing Belgium, it risks Germany, it risks France, it risks other countries. So I would say that this is the time to rethink about Schengen as a concept, as a free travel concept, and build border control and borders. Actually, there are no borders altogether in Europe. Now, if you cannot do that, and here let's go back to the question of the FBI, the European FBI. I know that I'm probably a minority by saying that, but I don't see an FBI, but I definitely see joint counterterrorism apparatuses of Europe. Those weakest links of Europe need to be supported and need to be replaced in a way by a European capability. If it's gathering open sources intelligence as a joint organization, if it's having a few operative apparatuses which will be jointly, such as a negotiation team in hostage barricade situations, and so on and so forth. Last but not least, you should very carefully learn those 5 points of the art of counterterrorism, and then you will be probably more secure. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Pavlina Reš. I would like to have a question for Mr. Ganor. I like your presentation. Thank you. And my question, here in Czech Republic, we have the saying that the desperate people make desperate things. Don't you think that, for example, Palestinian terrorism, as you mentioned, isn't a product of what I'm saying here? Because I worked in the Near East for a couple of years, and I felt that these people, I mean Palestinians, that they were in a situation where not to go forward, backward, and I didn't see the hope for them. Do you think that the money and the effort putting them to make them friends is better than to make enemies? I think better to not to stab your friend. It's difficult, but if you have enemy, it's just the circle. Thank you.
Thank you for asking the question. I don't envy the Palestinians. Actually, I think that the Palestinians are suffering a lot. If you ask me, as an Israeli, I would say that mainly suffering from their own fault and not because of Israel, because they never recognized the right of Israel to exist. Once they would recognize the right of Israel to exist, maybe we can happily live together in two states that live next to each other with security, maybe even more than security. So I personally support a Palestinian state that would be neighboring Israel, friendly to Israel, and would not replace Israel. My problem is with organizations like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and so many others that do not recognize the right of Israel to exist. That's the first part of my answer. The second part of my answer is the following one. And again, I do not represent Israel by saying that. I'm representing only my humble own views on that matter. I tend to believe that every nation around the world has the right for independence. Any people that want to have independence has this right. Again, not to argue that others doesn't have the right for independence and fighting them for that. But then again, I believe that the Palestinians, if they want independence, they should gain independence. You know what? I would say more than that. I think that any person that is really striving for independence, not on the account of others, he has the right to use violence sometimes in order to achieve this goal. But there is one type of violence which should be always forbidden, even if you have a legitimate cause, even if you have a holy cause. And this is the deliberate use of violence aimed against civilians, i.e. terrorism. So I would expect any person here, if he's a Muslim, if he's a Christian, if he's a Jew, I wouldn't expect him to support Israel. I wouldn't expect him to necessarily identify with Israeli goals. I would even understand if he identified with Palestinian crave for a homeland. But I would expect those liberal people around the world to come forward and say to their Palestinian friends, look, you should never deliberately attack Israeli civilians. We will support you as long as you do not conduct those terrorist attacks. If you do, you lose us. That's the idea. That's what I think we should share together. And yes, by the way, I don't think that economical reforms would be enough for that matter. I'm definitely for economical reforms for the Palestinians. But they have bigger inspirations than economical reforms, and rightly so. And they should get that, and they would get that at the moment that they would decide that it's not replacing the rights of the Jews to have their independent state in this region.
Dobrý den, Monika Hašková. Já bych měla dotaz na oba hosty, jestli mohu, a týká se současné migrační vlny a bezpečnosti. Čím si prosím vyslovujete neochotu nebo hlásání nemožnosti uzavřít schengenský prostor a kontrolovat a vybírat si ty lidi, kterým je potřeba případně opravdu pomoci? A čím si vysvětlujete naopak tu velkou ochotu elit Evropské unie a zároveň i řady novinářů pomáhat tomu, aby do Evropy nekontrolovaně proudili doslova 100 000 zcela cizích lidí, které už samozřejmě na území Evropské unie kontrolovat a monitorovat je nesrovnatelně těžší, než je kontrolovat u samotného vstupu.
It's the question for both. So,
look, the challenge, I begin by saying I understand that there are people who are legitimate refugees who come from Syria. And in my view, had we created a no-fly zone and a safe zone for people in Syria, we would not have the degree of refugee problem we have now. I also recognize that among the refugees are many who are not coming from Syria, but coming from Afghanistan or other parts of the world, and some of them, frankly, are economic migrants. They're coming for what they believe will be better economic opportunities. The challenge for Europe, and the problem is when people show up on the shore, it's kind of too late to process them. At that point, they're there. And there's almost an overwhelming force that comes in that makes it very difficult to separate who is a legitimate asylum candidate and who isn't. And of course, as we've seen over the last months, they don't necessarily stay in one place. They move around, and therefore there's a lack of ability to monitor or know who is where, and therefore to vet them and to make a judgment about who ought to get asylum and who ought not to. I think the original impulse to say to everybody, oh, come in, we'll take as many as you want, was a mistake because what it did is it encouraged more and more people to go to smugglers and get smuggled in. As I understand it now, what Europe is trying to do is work a deal with Turkey where people who come directly and illegally onto the shore will be sent back and they'll be processed in Turkey. And if they meet the requirements for asylum, they'll be admitted in, and if not, they won't be. I think that's probably a better way to approach this than just have people coming and trying to manage the problem inside Europe in the first instance. But I think it's indicative of the fact that this whole wave got started because there was a failure to strategically recognize that allowing Assad to drop bombs on civilians on the one side and having ISIS on the other was going to generate a huge mass migration. I would say this in the future. One of the big global security issues is going to be how do you deal with a mass movement of people? And the right way is to create an orderly situation, preferably where people are leaving from, where they can be vetted and they can be subject to a determination about whether they're fit for asylum, as opposed to reacting after people have come, and now you're in the position of not really being able to control where they go. So hopefully this process is getting more disciplined now as we move forward.
The immigration issue in Europe is a great model of this tension of the democratic dilemma in counterterrorism. Efficiency of security on one hand versus liberal democratic values. It's first and foremost a moral question here. And as a member of a nation that have been butchered, prosecuted, killed in the Holocaust during the Second World War, I would never recommend any nation around the world to disregard genuine refugees that are craving for asylum because their life is under risk. So I definitely understand the moral dilemma that the European countries have, and there are no easy solutions for that. One of the solutions have been mentioned by Michael, which is a very important one, the ability to screen and to identify those which are genuine political seekers, asylum seekers, and those which are trying to improve their economical situation, which can be prevented from getting into Europe in this regard. The other thing is maybe another idea of a solution or a temporary solution would be to create a safe zone in Syria and Iraq, maybe in the northern part of Syria and Iraq, being controlled with boots on the ground, as we say, with ground military activity to protect those asylum seekers, let them come to this safe zone, invest a considerable sum of money in giving them civilized conditions, not necessarily luxury, but civilized conditions, protect their life and protect their welfare, at least temporarily until things would stabilize in Syria and in Iraq. This might prevent the next wave of immigration to Europe. I wouldn't do this in Turkey, A, because I don't rely on the Turks, and B, because it will create a huge problem to the Turks as well. So I would do that in Syria and in Iraq with international extensive support to build up this safe zone for the refugees.
Thank you. I think we do have a time for the last question.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Ondřej Bos, and I have one question, or maybe comment to the first presentation where Mr. Chertoff few times stressed that gaining information, collecting, analyzing, and evaluating them is the key element for efficient fighting counter-terrorism. But I think that very often this information are used by relevant decision makers for implementation on past cases, past attacks, and we don't use them enough efficiently for proactive minding, for example. I want to ask you if you think that these authorities, these decision makers are enough open-minded and they use, for example, critical thinking and methods to be at least sometimes one step in front of the attackers, the terrorists. Thank you.
It's hard to generalize about whether decision makers use critical information. I do, critical thinking in terms of information. I do think it's important to have people educated into how to use information. One of the things that in our government we try to do is not simply give raw data to decision makers that hasn't been evaluated. Because you want to evaluate whether the source is reliable, whether the source has a motive to lie, whether the figures or the metrics give you a full picture of what it is you're looking at. So, I mean, I do think that part of the responsibility of an intelligence agency is to make sure that you don't just dump data on the decision maker, but you actually put it in a context that's informative. So, I mean, to that extent, I think it is important not just simply to collect and spill it out, but to put it in some kind of analytic framework.
Charles Ross, European Anti-Corruption Center. I'd like to thank CEVRO and Ambassador Vondra for hosting this important discussion today. Thank you, gentlemen. Secretary Chertoff, Professor Ganor, we haven't had time today to discuss the Russian element in this process. And briefly, I'd like to examine and ask your comments. We have parallel streams to look at. On the one hand, we have what appears to be a quixotic, but in fact very carefully planned opportunistic approach of the Putin government to create measured destabilization and advantages for the Russian government. On the other hand, we see from our own OSINT work and that of many others that in fact there is both a flow of fighters to ISIS or Daesh and a flow of weapons from various parts of the former Eastern Bloc. And I'd appreciate your thoughts on how OSINT and a closer examination of this could help us get a better grip on this. Thank you, gentlemen.
Okay, I will answer. I will give you the first answer because I think Michael should close the evening. On one hand, I think that what we saw in the last few months is a very smart move by Mr. Putin, who actually identified a lacuna, a loophole, a gap that was created by the Americans in Syria and in Iraq. I don't criticize the Americans for that because President Obama said, and I fully understand why, that his policy would be that he would fight ISIS in Syria and Iraq, but with no boots on the ground. Now, if he would ask me or any Israeli expert, we would tell him that when you're dealing with a hybrid terrorist organization, i.e. a terrorist organization that controls both territory and population and is embedded in the civilian population, you cannot win such a war just with air bombings and so on and so forth. You need boots on the ground. And I would ask him, if not boots on the ground, at least sandals on the ground, i.e. special units and not battalions and so on and so forth. But he made his decision, and I fully understand why. He couldn't win this war. The Russians came, and they came with a different attitude, although in most cases they don't have boots on the ground as well, but they don't have the liberal democratic constraints that Obama has and the Americans has and the Western countries have there. They are not reluctant to use bombings that will risk the lives of many civilians altogether, but it was very effective. And actually, this was the reason why we saw ISIS start to lose the war and actually start to be very concerned with this situation. I think that the new challenges of global and local jihadist terrorism is posing a new need for a new international approach, new international cooperations, and I include, by the way, the Russians and the Americans and the Europeans and Muslim countries and Arab countries, maybe even Israel in this regard, to have new apparatuses that will fight a common enemy. I have to say that maybe it's first time in history that ISIS became a common enemy of the whole world. He is a common enemy of Muslim countries. He is a common enemy of United States, of Russia, of Europe, of Israel, of many other countries altogether. And this might serve as a good platform to establish new apparatuses and new doctrines and new thinking of how to counter this phenomenon.
I agree with everything Boaz said, and I'm not going to repeat it. I would say this. I would say that, first of all, I understand the desire that President Obama had not to get engaged in what he perceived as a ground war. But I will tell you that when you begin a fight and you announce all the stuff you're not going to do, you're going to lose the fight. You know, the Taliban used to say, the Americans have the watches, we have the time. And I think one of the lessons we learned in the surge was, in 2007 Iraq, sometimes you do have to actually put people in there and they have to be embedded in the community. They can't just show up and then leave. In particular, I think what was a real missed opportunity, and it was said at the time by a number of people, was not to create a safe zone and a no-fly zone in Syria, because that would have relieved a lot of the pressure that has driven the migration crisis. And while I can't say that that Putin had a conception at the very beginning that he was going to create a migration crisis as a way to undercut and create division within NATO, I think, as a number of people have observed, he sees the opportunity and he sees the benefit of distracting Europe and creating internal dissension, because his real agenda is to be able to get himself embedded where he wants to be in Ukraine and maybe other places. So, you know, we are where we are, but I do think Boaz is right. There is a common enemy, but you have to have your eyes wide open. The important thing is not to pay an exorbitant price for getting cooperation from the Russians and other countries, because I tell you, it's as much in their interest as it is in ours.
And the definitely last question is Karel Schwarzenberg.
Well, one question I was very interested to hear before, when you were asked about the motivation, that none of yours mentioned religion or the Muslim faith, which was a very much discussed theme in this country. Actually, I rather have a similar view, because, let's be honest, we had 80 years ago in this part of the world a similar institution like the Daesh. It was the Nazi Party, which first detected that and used it, that violence and the chance to kill other people attracts, that it is a very attractive program for many people. Second, that you can base a movement on hatred. In those times, it was the Jews, and to despise other people, save us who are the first race, we are the true fighters for Islam or whatever. But none of them, as in the Nazi time, had a clear idea what he was fighting. The hatred was the first reason. They believed the Führer, but nobody had a clear idea what. And I have the impression that the Daesh fighters are fighting for Muslim faith. It's not quite clear, and I doubt even that they are really very religious. So that's a question. Do you think the Islam or any kind plays a real role, or is rather a pretext of other things?
Okay, actually, I would like to thank you for insisting to ask the last question, because I think it's very important to touch base with this question. Now, it's important for me to say that, as a Jew, that terrorism is not a new phenomenon. Terrorism, actually, we saw in modern history coming from different organizations being activated in order to promote different grievances, socio-economical grievances, political grievances, nationalistic grievances, as you have mentioned, extreme ideologies, communism, fascism, anarchism, and so on and so forth. I tend to agree that when terrorism is being motivated by religious grievances, it's much more dangerous than any other type of previous type of terrorism. Why? Because when people induce to the hatred and the political goals and interests and so on and so forth, the concept of God's will, we are fulfilling a fatwa, we are fulfilling a divine command, then it becomes very dangerous. By the way, regardless from which religion. So maybe, unlike some of my colleagues in different parts of the world, I don't see Islam as more dangerous and more dogmatic than other religions. And I'm not saying that in order to be politically correct, because I'm not a politically correct person. I really genuinely believe that every religion might be very dangerous if people with bad intentions misinterpret the religion in order to provoke people to conduct violence under the so-called God's will. But what we do have is a problem not with the religion of Islam. We have a problem in the religion of Islam right now. And let me explain that by sharing an anecdote with you. A few years ago, I was invited to give a talk in Brussels. And before I was giving my talk, there was another speaker. He was an imam, a Muslim religious cleric. And he preached to the European, to the Belgic crowd. And he said, how dare you refer to Islam as if it is something to do with terrorism? Do you know what Islam is all about? Islam is the religion of peace and clemency. Why do you use even the term jihadi terrorism as we used it today? You know what jihad is all about. Jihad is all about doing good deeds and not those atrocities. So why do you do that? And then was my turn. He was still in the room, and I was referring to him in my opening speech. And I said, my friend, let me sincerely thank you from the bottom of my heart that you took the trouble to fly from Sudan. He was an imam in Sudan, from Sudan to Brussels, to share with us those two important messages, which is so important for us as Jews and Christians and non-Muslims to understand that Islam has nothing to do with this violent activity. The jihad is all about doing good deeds and not those atrocities. But between you and me, my friend, I don't really understand why did you bother to fly from Sudan to Brussels to share those important messages with us instead of staying in Sudan or crossing to Iraq or to Syria or to Yemen or to Afghanistan. I can mention so many countries and tell those people which are beheading innocent civilians under the name of Islam, raising the flag of jihad, that what they do is against Islamic concepts and jihadi verdicts. Because if you have a task in your life as a Muslim religious cleric is to preach those important messages to your own constituency, and that's what you do 24/7 all your life, because you have a problem in Islam that you, the Muslims, need to solve. We are just suffer from the implications of that. But it's mainly a problem of the Muslims themselves inside Islam and not with the religion of Islam.
Michael has agreed, and there is electricity. Look, thank you very much. Thank you for you, because you are here. You made the evening successful too. This is just also to inform you that it's rather the exception, but we do have another evening here or late afternoon on Wednesday. So in 2 days, George Friedman, the author of a very well-known book on the European crisis, will be here with us. The book has been translated and published in Czech under the title Ohrožená Evropa. So the book will be available, and after his lecture, your questions, there will be also the opportunity to get book with his signature. So those who want to come, this is just to remind you that we will start on this Wednesday as usually, so at 5 p.m. And of course, I have to thank IDC Herzliya for helping us with this particular evening, but the greatest thanks, of course, belongs to both of you, Michael, Boaz, because I think your contribution made this evening really great. So thank you very much for being with us.